Okay, so let's imagine for a second election night, right? The results are coming in, and bam, Kamala Harris is projected to be the next president. What's the first thing that pops into your head? Relief. Just total elation. Or maybe just a little like, what happens now?
It is interesting you put it that way. That's kind of the vibe we're picking up from these online discussions we're diving into. It's not just like who wins,
Yeah.
it's what comes after that really has people going.
We're talking a full spectrum of reactions, yeah. Everything from like cautious optimism to some pretty out there doomsday scenarios.
Totally. I mean, you see stuff like doomsday averted for now,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and that just kind of sums up the whole feeling. Like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next.
Kind of like in a scary movie when you think the bad guy's down and then bam, a finger twitches.
Exactly. And that whole sense of danger,
Yeah.
it gets even bigger when you think about January 6th. It keeps coming up in these discussions.
I mean, it's more than just coming up, right? People are straight up scared of it happening again. And maybe even worse this time. We're seeing comments about armed groups, the vote counting turning into like a standoff.
The interesting thing is that a lot of the anxiety seems to come from this idea that if someone's in charge that's less sympathetic to the insurrectionists, it might actually set them off more.
Yeah, that is a chilling thought when you put it that way. But it shows you how deep this distrust goes. And not just in the government and stuff, but in each other too. Which leads to another question. What happens to the whole Magier thing if Trump's not the one in charge? Does it just kind of fizzle out? Or is it more like a fire that's just waiting for the next gust of wind, you know?
That's the big question. Some people think that there's no replacing Trump and his charisma. That ability he has to tap into a certain, anger, resentment, whatever you want to call it. Like he's Coca-Cola. Nothing else really compares. You know
Mm.
what I mean?
That's a really good analogy. But on the other hand, you got people who are terrified that someone who can do what he does, only better, could be way more dangerous. Someone who can make it all sound, I don't know, more acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. And they're pointing to people like J.D. Vance, right?
Yeah.
Someone who could actually bridge that gap between the far right and the more traditional conservatives.
And all this uncertainty about what Magier becomes ties right into the bigger picture of the Republican Party. It's pretty clear they're having a bit of an identity crisis right now.
Yeah, total identity crisis.
It's like they put their playlist on shuffle and now they have no clue what song's coming next. You see it in all the chaos around the Speaker of the House election.
100%.
One person even said it was a perfect example of the GOP's internal struggles.
Right.
You got traditional conservatives battling it out with corporate interests, then you got the far right. It's a mess.
It's not even just about like what they believe in, it's about
Yeah.
power. Who gets to decide what being a Republican even means now? Especially in the age of Trump, right?
Yeah.
But what's more? What happens if they can't agree?
Now, that is a question with some serious implications. And not just for the Republicans, but for everything, really.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because obviously the presidency is a big deal, but a lot of people in these discussions are focusing on what happens with Congress and the courts, too. They seem to get that even if Harris does win, it's not over.
Because even if she's in the White House, a Republican Congress could just shut down her entire agenda, not to mention the Supreme Court. That's a whole other can of worms that's got people worried.
Definitely. There are comments all over about the court becoming authoritarian. People are afraid. Basic democratic stuff is going away. It's a big deal to a lot of people.
Especially when you consider the state legislatures. They've got a ton of power when it comes to elections and how they're run. That's just a whole other thing people are trying to wrap their heads around.
And it all points back to this idea that keeps popping up, this idea that American democracy is super fragile. And even if Harris wins, the system itself might be in more trouble than we realize.
It's a lot to think about, but that's what makes these discussions so important. If we want to figure out how to deal with whatever's coming, we've got to understand what people are hoping for, what they're afraid of, what's motivating them, right?
Exactly. It's like we're getting a glimpse into what everyone's thinking, right? And it's a country that's on the verge of some huge, maybe even seismic changes. And that fragility we were talking about, it's like super obvious when you look at what people think a Harris win would mean. It's not even about policy anymore. It's about completely different ways of seeing the world,
Mm.
values and all that.
It's like that comment we saw about how this whole political thing has shown everyone just how many people have kind of disturbing views. Racism, being scared of anyone who isn't from here, even wanting a dictator. It's kind of wild to think about how deep that stuff goes.
It's like someone pulled back the curtain and now everyone's trying to process what they're seeing. And that's where things get kind of interesting because the conversation changes. It's not about the election so much anymore. It's more about the whole system.
Yeah.
Can it even deal with this much division?
So less about putting out the fire and more about fireproofing the whole house.
Yeah, exactly. And people are talking about like changing how we vote completely. Ranked choice voting, getting rid of the Electoral College, the whole 9 yards. Maybe the two-party system is actually making us hate each other more.
It's kind of crazy to think about, right? But there's also this, I don't know if it's hope exactly, maybe more like determination. Like, this isn't going to be pretty, but we're not just going to sit here and watch everything burn.
100%. People are realizing that democracy means you got to actually, do something. We see people talking about local elections, getting involved in their communities, donating money to stuff they believe in. It's fighting back against just giving up.
It's like that comment about putting away the strychnine dinner. I mean, dark humor for sure, but it shows you how real the fear is, but also how much people refuse to give up.
And part of that seems to be like getting ready for anything. We see a lot of people talking about lawsuits if Harris wins, recounts, maybe even another January 6th thing, but like a different version.
Right, there was that comment comparing it to the impeach Kamala bumper stickers. It's like, people are already planning for the next fight before this one's even over.
Yeah, it's exhausting just to think about, right? But it's like people are realizing that this constant fighting, this always election thing we're stuck in, it wears you down.
Yeah, totally. It makes you wonder, can we even deal with the stuff we actually need to deal with? Climate change, the economy. Not if we're always at each other's throats about this other stuff.
100%. It's like we're so busy trying to win the game, we forgot why we're even playing.
Oh.
But let's bring it back down to earth for a sec. We talked about the president, but what are people saying about how all this affects Congress, the Supreme Court, even the future of the Republican Party itself?
Well, with Congress, everyone seems to get that a Harris win isn't a cure-all. If the Republicans control Congress, they can basically block everything she wants to do, especially if they're still fighting amongst themselves.
And then there's the Supreme Court. A lot of people are really worried about that whole thing. Could Harris even fix it? Or is it too far gone?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Especially with the Republicans potentially in charge of the Senate. It'll be interesting to see how they approach it. But the most interesting thing to me is how people are dealing with what happens to the Republicans long term.
Can they even come back from all this? Are we seeing like a whole new era of American politics?
Right. Are they going to go all in on Trumpism, even without Trump? Or will they split up? And what about people like J.D. Vance? What's their role in all this? Are they going to try to be the new Trump? Or are they going to do something totally different?
It's like we're watching the whole thing rearrange itself right in front of us, and there's no way to know what it'll look like when it's done. But one thing's for sure, it's going to be a wild ride.
It really is something else, this whole thing. It's like, how do you even keep up with all of it when it's changing this fast?
It's definitely a challenge to wrap your head around, that's for sure. But I think one thing that's helpful is remembering that we're not just talking about politics in the abstract.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people and their actual lives and what they're hoping for, what they're scared of. That's what shapes these conversations.
Totally. And sometimes those fears come out in some pretty unexpected ways. Remember that story we talked about with the strychnine dinner? It's dark, yeah, but it also tells you something about what people are feeling deep down.
Exactly. For a lot of people, this isn't just some game.
Right.
This is about their safety, being able to live their lives, basic rights. All of it's on the line.
And the thing is, right alongside that fear, you see this, okay, so what do we do about it? People aren't just going to sit around and wait for the sky to fall. They're ready to do something.
Right. We see a lot of talk about local elections, getting organized in their communities, supporting groups that are fighting for, keeping democracy going. It's a good kind of energy, I think. Like they're pushing back.
Yeah. Like, okay, things might get a little bumpy, but we're going to have a life raft and know how to swim. And hey, maybe even build a better boat while we're at it.
That's a great way to put it, because even with everything so messed up, there's still that idea that we can do something, that we're not just along for the ride. We actually get a say in how this all turns out.
That's a good thing to remember, especially after everything we've talked about today.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up, let's bring it back to that idea. What can people listening take away from all of this, besides just, I don't know, a better understanding of what's going on in politics?
The big thing is, pay attention, don't check out, and remember that what you do matters. It does. Whether that's local stuff, talking to friends and family about all this, or even just knowing what's going on and holding politicians' feet to the fire, every little thing adds up.
I like that. It's a good reminder that even when things seem really big and scary, we still have choices, both on our own and together. That's something worth remembering no matter what happens.